Rottenberg is the co-founder and CEO of Endeavor, a nonprofit organization that is transforming economies across the globe through high-impact entrepreneurship. With offices in over 20 countries, Endeavor manages to support over 500 organizations, entrepreneurial firms, that collectively command over $6 billion and give high-quality jobs to over 225,000 people. Linda is considered one of the world's most dynamic experts on entrepreneurship and emerging markets, having been mentioned and featured in Time's 100 Innovators for the 21st Century and Forbes Impact 30. Linda also currently serves as an advisor for ABRAAJ Capital, a leading private equity investor in global growth markets. Linda is a graduate from Harvard College and Yale Law School and currently resides in Brooklyn, New York with her husband and twin daughters. So it's my honor to introduce you. Please let's give a warm welcome to Linda Rottenberg.
Impressive. I haven't memorized my resume. In the spring of 1998, I walked into an unassuming office in an unnamed neighborhood in Buenos Aires. I was there to meet Wences Casares, a charismatic 24-year-old who grew up on a sheep farm in Patagonia and now had an unlikely idea to create the E-Trade of Latin America. When I walked out, I was carrying one of the most important lessons I've learned about entrepreneurship. The most valuable backer you will need to start any venture is not your mother, father, spouse, boss, banker, or friend. It's you. And you are the hardest backer you'll ever have to win. Now, Wences had started several ventures before, but they had pretty low stakes. This time, he dropped out of college and convinced his two sisters to drop out with him. After Wences flew to Patagonia to inform his dad that his 3 children were now all college dropouts, Dad said, "Don't fool around." Then things got really scary. Wences was running low on cash, 32 local investors had turned him down, and his sisters were now sleeping on his couch in a tiny apartment that they shared. But Wences was a doer, and he kept going with the financial services firm he called Patagon.com. "Do you think I'm crazy?" he asked me. "Yes," I said, "and that's why you're going to succeed." I co-founded Endeavor to support dreamers and doers like Wences. Endeavor is among the first organizations to focus on the scale-up phase of entrepreneurship. We've screened over 40,000 entrepreneurs in the past 17 years and selected over 900 individuals to be part of our network. We call these entrepreneurs high-impact entrepreneurs, and they're the ones with the biggest ideas, the likeliest potential to build businesses that matter and grow, and the greatest ability to inspire others. Once selected as Endeavor entrepreneurs, these leaders receive a suite of customized services: mentorship, professional advisory boards, talent recruitment, leadership training, including an executive program here at Stanford Business School, and access to capital. After 15 years of operating what Bill Draper called venture capital without the capital, we decided it was time to create a fund to invest in our entrepreneurs directly. It's called Endeavor Catalyst, and we now co-invest in our entrepreneurs, but in a rule-based way that allows us to maintain the trust and neutrality that are key to our model. Today, Endeavor operates in 20 countries on 5 continents. The entrepreneurs we've selected now lead 600 companies that produce over $6.5 billion in revenues and now over 400,000 jobs. After focus on the emerging markets for 15 years, we broadened our mandate to also include the US and Europe when Greece and Spain and Miami called. I said, I get it. Now we also operate in the submerging markets. Next up, the Philippines, Italy, Nigeria, and Detroit. When Endeavor started out, the word entrepreneur wasn't very popular. There wasn't even a word to describe a startup founder in Spanish, Portuguese, or Arabic. And even in the US, people considered entrepreneurship this niche idea that mainly took place around these grounds and involved young techies in hoodies. Today, entrepreneurship has gone mainstream. I attend a lot of conferences where politicians get up and want to promote entrepreneurship as a cure to the social and economic woes of their country. Fortune 500 companies are also trying to get in the game. They see entrepreneurs eating their lunch, and they want to know what's that secret sauce of innovation and agility. And every day at my daughter's school drop-off, I hear of moms and dads starting companies or nonprofits. They want more control over their schedule, and they no longer believe that good jobs are out there waiting for them. So I've come to believe that entrepreneurship isn't just for entrepreneurs anymore. Everyone needs to take more risks or risk being left behind. But the problem is we don't really have a language to describe all of these new people engaging in entrepreneurial activity. Many people, including myself, have taken an already clunky word, entrepreneur, and made it even clunkier by adding all these qualifiers. We have social entrepreneur, micro-entrepreneur, mompreneur, kidpreneur, copreneur. People got so fed up that on Twitter, they just took to doing hashtag traps. Trust me, we need a new lexicon. So I made one up. Now, I've given the name of animal species to 4 different types of entrepreneurs, depending on the arena in which they work. Let's see if one applies to you. 1, gazelles. In the mid-1980s, the economist David Birch classified gazelles as companies whose sales double every 4 years. Now, while only 2 to 4% of companies actually fit this description, this is what we've come to believe of as entrepreneurs. It applies to tech founders like Mark Zuckerberg and Steve Jobs, but I also include high-growth non-tech company founders like Sam Walton or Richard Branson or Oprah Winfrey. Most Endeavor entrepreneurs are gazelles, and many of you will take that path. 2, skunks. Other people call them intrapreneurs, but I prefer to call people disrupting inside companies skunks. I borrowed the term from the Lockheed Martin's famous Skunk Works project that created fighter jets. And actually, the colleagues of the people inside Skunk Works thought the name came from the fact that they were so overworked they didn't even bother to take showers. But in fact, it actually comes from the moonshine business in the comic strip Lil Abner. They ground up dead skunks to make the moonshine. But anyway, regardless, I believe that innovators inside companies have to work to stink up the joint. And anybody who's applying to work in a corporate firm or a consulting firm or a bank should know that your jobs and your corporations are no longer safe and stable anymore, so you better hone your skunk skills. Okay, 3, dolphins. This is probably more commonly known to you as the social entrepreneurs, people seeking to create change in the nonprofit or public sector. I was lucky enough to start my career working 2 of the greatest social entrepreneurs, Wendy Kopp of Teach for America and Bill Drayton of Ashoka. But despite all the hype, I believe that many people working in these sectors are actually not deploying the entrepreneurial skills. So I chose dolphins because it's known as one of the most smart and altruistic animals, and because we need to continue to make waves in these more languishing sectors. And 4, butterflies. This last group represents the small-scale or lifestyle entrepreneurs. They can be sole proprietors or firms with just a few employees. 40% of Americans have at some point worked for themselves. And of the 7 million firms that actually employ people in this country, 90% employ less than 20. As Jay-Z put it, I'm not a businessman, I'm a businessman. I'm dubbing this group butterflies because they're varied and individualistic and aim mainly for freedom. In previous eras, these would be the mom and pops who didn't really have a need for entrepreneurial skills. But now, the guy selling cheese at the farmer's market probably has an in-it phone at Whole Foods, is setting up a web business, and takes credit cards with his Square reader. And while many of you will stick with one species throughout your career, a number of you will take the Bill Gates model. He's a gazelle turned dolphin, and shift arenas over the course of your career. But what's clear is that whatever species, whatever arena you choose, everyone today needs to take more risks. But then how do you ensure you're taking smart risks? I've spent 2 decades at Endeavor helping entrepreneurs to think big and execute small. In other words, to de-risk risk. And I've spent the past year finishing a book that talks about each of these species and the skills they each need to move forward. Today, I want to share some of the lessons I've learned. But before we get going, I want to share a little bit more about my own story. I grew up in a traditional household outside of Boston. My parents met in Rhode Island at a school dance when they were 14 and 17. My dad was a lawyer, my mom was a homemaker. My parents are incredibly loving, focused on education, and almost genetically risk-averse. They value stability and security. And some of that rubbed off on me. As you heard, I went to Harvard and then applied the safe path to law school. But as soon as I arrived at Yale Law School, I figured I didn't want to be a lawyer. And this was actually hard for me to admit because for my whole life up until then, I'd taken the safe path. I'd wanted to please others. Now I wanted to figure out who I was and what I wanted to be. So on a whim, after graduation, I flew to sleep on the couch of my pen pal from Uruguay. My parents made sure I took the bar exam before I left and were convinced it was just a phase. Soon I moved to Buenos Aires and started dancing tango and cheering for local soccer teams. I paid my way by working at a local law school and later for Ashoka. But I was also becoming enchanted with a new celebrity back home, the startup CEO. This was the gilded age of Steve Jobs, Michael Dell and Howard Schultz and Bill Gates, and it was the dramatic comeback of Steve Jobs, who wound out becoming a skunk inside his own company. I became a convert to entrepreneurship. It seemed to fit the moment of rebellion and individualism as I was experiencing. It seemed daring. Then one day, late for a meeting in Buenos Aires, I hopped into a taxi and struck up a conversation with the driver. He told me he had an engineering degree but couldn't find a job. Forgive me, I said to the driver, but wouldn't you rather be... I paused. I couldn't think of the word for entrepreneur in Spanish. So I said in English, an entrepreneur? A what? He said. An entrepreneur, someone who starts a new business. Empresario, he said, dismissing the name of the term for big businessman. I said, no es empresario, es otra palabra. What's the word in Spanish for entrepreneur? I don't think we have a word like that here, he said. Well, that explains it, I thought. No wonder I hadn't seen any high-flying innovators in Latin America. Not only did they not have any startup capital, they didn't even have a word for such a person. Suddenly, I had a vision. What if there were an organization to find entrepreneurs around the world and help bring their ideas to scale? What if we could harness the power of individual dreamers to transform local economies? What if we could create a global movement around innovation? I talked up my idea to everyone I knew when I went back home to the States. Nothing. Nada. No one had any clue what I was talking about. Entrepreneurs and emerging markets. I racked up the ding letters telling me why my idea was bound to fail. And that's when I learned another important lesson about starting something up. Being misunderstood is part of the process. If you're aiming to disrupt the status quo, then you can't expect those following the status quo to embrace your idea. Often your best hope is to find another outlier who's passionate about the same thing. And in my case, that person was Peter Kellner. He was at HBS at the time. He had started companies in Russia and Eastern Europe and had just come back from China, where he too had the idea of supporting entrepreneurs around the world. And we decided to team up. Our first meeting took place at my parents' kitchen table. We sketched out the plan for Endeavor on a napkin, an actual napkin. Now, my parents in the room were not pleased. Linda, you're not thinking of giving up your job for this, are you? My mom said. My dad reminded me of the promise I'd made. I could take some time off the treadmill, but would ultimately settle on a career. If I wasn't interested in law, then how about consulting? My mom tried a different tack. Your eggs aren't getting any younger, she said. I was 28 and a half at the time, and by then my mother had had my brother and I and was pregnant with my sister. You definitely need to stop getting all those planes if you ever hope to get married, she said. So here I was, caught between what my parents wanted for me and what I wanted for myself. It was that same feeling that Wences had watching his sisters sleeping on that couch. And it's the same moment of confrontation that every entrepreneur I know has handled. It's the juncture between doing what's safe and expected and what's uncertain and unknown. It's the junction between fear and hope. I chose hope. I told my mother, I can't turn back. This is what I need to do. This is who I need to be. I've thought of that moment at my parents' kitchen table a lot because I believe that my passion to help entrepreneurs is fueled by a desire to help them push through similar moments when few people believe and when they feel most alone. As I mentioned earlier, the first lesson of entrepreneurship is that you cannot look to others to validate your dreams. Look to yourself. As the legendary Bob Jones said about golf, it's a game played on a 5-inch course, the distance between your ears. Now, as soon as you give your permission to dream big and take a chance, brace yourself. Someone, or more likely everyone, is now going to criticize your choice. In my experience, almost all entrepreneurs at one point or another have been accused of being out of their minds. You can't rock the boat without being called that you're off your rocker. So how should we respond? Own it. I learned this in one of the most defining moments of my career. So a few months after that kitchen table encounter, I got a call that I had a 10-minute meeting with Eduardo Elstein. Eduardo was a college dropout from Argentina who had talked his way into a meeting with George Soros, walked out of the meeting with a $10 million check that he proceeded to turn into the largest landowning empire in the country. 5 minutes into our meeting, Eduardo looked at his watch and said to me, "Okay, I'll see what I can do to get you a meeting with George Soros." "Thank you very much," I said, "but I don't want to meet George Soros." "Look, Eduardo," I said, "you're an entrepreneur. I'm an entrepreneur. This is an organization to support entrepreneurs. Here's what I want: your time, your passion, and $200,000. Now, our meeting had taken place in English, but at this point, he looks over at his right-hand man and says, "Esta chica está loca." He says it was like being in a bad movie when the heroine seems nice and charming and then you're in the shower and she's coming at you with a knife. So I said, "Eduardo, estoy decepcionada." This heroine understands Spanish. This from the guy who walked into George Soros' office and came out with $10 million. You're lucky I only asked you for $200,000. Eduardo gaped at me, turned to Oscar, took out his checkbook, and wrote me a check for $200,000 on the spot and became the chairman of Endeavor Argentina. To this day, people in Latin America know me as La Chica Loca, and the nickname spread to the Middle East. But I don't mind. As I like to say, crazy is a compliment. That's actually the title of my book. Crazy is a compliment. And there is a corollary, which is that if you're not called crazy, you're probably not thinking big enough. Okay. So now I'd like to share 6 lessons that I've gleaned from helping nearly 1,000 entrepreneurs through the startup and scale-up phases of entrepreneurship. I'm going to divide the challenges by our species, but some of these may vary equally across the gazelles, skunks, dolphins, and butterflies. Let's begin with gazelles. Wences, the Patagonian sheep farmer turned financially services maverick, became an Endeavor entrepreneur in 1998. We then introduced him to VCs. We found him a COO. We sent him a Stanford MBA to help him with an expansion plan. He also married my assistant, Belle. Endeavor is a full-service organization. And 18 months later, he sold Patagon.com to Banco Santander for $750 million. He became an instant role model throughout Latin America. Young people looked at him and said, "If Wences can do it, I can too." Today, Wences lives not far from here. He's on to his 5th company, this one having to do with Bitcoin, still married to my assistant. And he is still one of the most prolific mentors of entrepreneurs, not only in Latin America, but really all over the world. But before he earned the success, Wences, like most gazelles I meet, faced a number of challenges. Here are the 3 most common I've seen. Lesson 1, stop planning, start doing. Last year, I appeared on the Today Show in a segment about helping people start their own businesses. And my fellow guest was an MBA who explained that she had written a 75-page business plan for her internet business, and she recommended that all viewers do the same. I nearly fell off my stool. I told Kathy Lee and Hoda, on that we can agree to disagree. But wait a minute, how can this be? You know that the one thing you need is a plan. You had numbers, buzzwords, projections, graphs. You have to have a PowerPoint to impress your bosses, your friends, your lover. This thing is called a business plan. Well, Endeavor's plan fit on a napkin. Intel's business plan was 161 words and included a number of typos, including the word "and" misspelled. 2/3 of Endeavor entrepreneurs did not create a business plan. A survey of Inc. 500 companies showed that only 12% conducted formal market research before launch, and only 40% created formal business plans. And of those who did create formal business plans, 2/3 admitted ditching the plans shortly thereafter. So rather than dive into market analysis, give yourself permission to view the world differently, and then act on what you see. Instead of looking at the writing on the wall, look on at the spaces in between. The philosopher Kostka Bradotin writes that whatever human accomplishments there have been in history have been possible precisely because of this empty space. Or as I like to say, the best innovators focus on pain points, not PowerPoints. They stop planning and start doing. Lesson 2, don't bet the farm. Now, Ray Kroc, the man who built McDonald's, once said, if you're not a risk taker, then get the hell out of business. This is the image most people have about entrepreneurship, and that it's about maximizing risk, tilting at windmills, going all in. And like a lot of business, this has a certain macho bravado appeal. In fact, the phrase bet the farm comes from the Wild West, when betting the farm at a card draw of poker meant that you had cojones. But boys will be boys, and entrepreneurs will be savvy. The research we did in Endeavor showed that the attitude towards risk is very different. Almost all of the Endeavor entrepreneurs veered towards the middle in terms of their attitude towards risk, not the extreme. 95% said they did not risk food or shelter for their families when starting their companies, and more than 80% had enough savings or other resources to cover basic expenses for 1 year. In my experience, most entrepreneurs are not risk maximizers, they're risk minimizers. They don't focus on optimal returns, they focus on acceptable loss. They may wager a few chickens, but they don't bet the farm. Now, one of the ways founders today mitigate risk is by applying the lean startup methods of Eric Ries. And I am all for minimum viable products, but today I want to focus on another method. This is part of what I call the dark arts of entrepreneurship. And it's something that many entrepreneurs I know have used. Sometimes the only way to advance your idea is to be persistent. This was my strategy for recruiting backers. I trapped them in confined spaces from which they could not escape. I loitered outside airplane bathrooms. I lurked in fancy restaurants. I hovered over gym treadmills. Yes, I was a stalker. That leads me to the next lesson. Lesson 3, stalking is an underrated startup strategy. This is how Josephine Esther Menser got started. Estelle Menser, as she was known, was an outsider, born to Hungarian Jewish immigrants in an Italian neighborhood in Queens. She coveted luxury. One day, she asked a woman in a beauty salon where she had gotten that beautiful blouse. The woman replied, "What difference would it make? You can't afford it." Estelle walked away from that incident, vowing that she would have it all. Jewels, exquisite arts, gracious homes, everything. Her uncle was a chemist who had a line of skin creams that he couldn't sell. So Estelle began stalking. She would stop people in trains, in elevators, on the market, on the way to a Salvation Army meeting. She'd whip out her jar of super rich, all-purpose cream and tell her unsuspecting victims that they had wrinkles, but she could make them glow. When the ladies demurred, saying really they had somewhere else to be, Estelle cut them off. Just give me 5 minutes. When she became successful enough to open her own business, she began by adopting a name that better fit with her image of luxury she was trying to cultivate. She used her married name, Lauder, and changed her first name to Estee. She stalked retailers, too. Estee dreamed of getting into Saks Fifth Avenue, but the Saks buyer kept turning her away. So Estee got creative. At a charity luncheon at the Waldorf Astoria, she gave away lipstick in metallic sheaths, which were a big step up from the plastic containers they were in. When the women lined up and said, where could they get more of these products, Estee smiled and told them to go across the street to Saks. Soon a line formed at Saks that spilled out the door and crossed the street. The next day, the Saks buyer called and ordered $800 worth. This goes back to mindset. Entrepreneurship is a story of outsiders. You've got to give yourself permission to try something outside of the ordinary to get your idea out the door. Now, for skunks, those working inside corporations, giving yourself permission to be contrarian carries a specific sort of fear. Fear of the F word, failure. That's the #1 barrier to innovation in large organizations. A 2013 survey of 500 large companies found that 40% of executives cited anxiety about being responsible for mistakes or failures as their greatest impediment to action. Better to just keep quiet and doing your job. In my book, I discuss a lot of examples of skunks who break through this fear, but I want to focus on just one leader today, India's iconic businessman, Ratan Tata. The 75-year-old executive ran a conglomerate of over 100 companies, from software to steel to tea, that generates over $100 billion in revenues. And in his last year as chairman, Tata instituted an unconventional award, an award for the best failed idea. My fourth lesson is inspired by this global businessman. Lesson 4, don't fear the F word. And every now and then, give yourself an A for getting an F. Okay, let's move on to dolphins. Those of you who aim to use your entrepreneurial skills to solve social problems may have a different worry. How do you attract and retain talent if you don't have stock options that could be worth millions? And how do you build an A team when people keep asking, what's your overhead? All right, for starters, if anyone asks you, what's your overhead? I recommend walking out of the room. I tell prospective funders of Endeavor that the 2 main costs will be people and travel, and that our model depends on A employees to execute. And that if they actually are not comfortable with that, they should look elsewhere. But even if you pay your team at the 90th percentile, you're never going to compete with the hottest companies. But here's the thing. Today, and you'll know this better than anyone, millennials don't, and young people in general, don't care only or even mainly about a paycheck. A 2012 survey by Net Impact found that 72% of college students reported that a job that allows them to make an impact was very important to their happiness. And a study released this week by the National Society of High School Scholars ranked 25 companies where top millennials most want to work in 2014. Over 12,000 members from 160 companies participated. And here's an interesting fact. 73% were women, so they leaned in. The list contained a number of surprises. So healthcare companies and U.S. government agencies are the most sought-after categories, taking up 14 of the 25 slots. The #1 ranked company, St. Jude's Children's Research Hospital, which focuses on childhood diseases, including cancer. And while Google, Apple, Disney, DreamWorks, Starbucks, and Amazon made the list, they were dwarfed by government agencies and armed services, including the FBI, CIA, State Department, NASA, Air Force, Army, and Navy. And what these disparate set of winners share is that they have one thing in common, at least, and they understand that young people today want autonomy, crave collaboration, and demand meaning. And that brings me to the 5th lesson. Psychic equity is as important, if not more important, than financial equity. And speaking of government jobs, the FAA, the 50-year-old agency charged with overseeing aviation, learned this lesson the hard way. For years, the agency recruiters pitched something familiar to the federal government. You will get a good job with good benefits. And this seemed to work for the boomers. And then the millennials came in and said, why would we want to work for this stodgy old bureaucracy? Things got so bad at the FAA, they actually started hiring high school seniors for air traffic controller positions because they couldn't otherwise fill the slots. And then Ventris Gibson, the head of HR, had an epiphany. The FAA isn't a stodgy, stale bureaucracy. It is the backbone of the US of A. 2 million people take flights every day domestically in the US, and globally the FAA is reshaping the aerospace industry. So today, the website says, working at the FAA offers a unique opportunity to experience a career where your impact not only reaches the aviation industry, but around the world. Millennials are applying in droves. Now, you might be thinking, all right, I get all these lessons, but what if the timing isn't right? It's a recession, it's a bear market, maybe an internet bubble. Well, I can't afford to lose my job. Ignore these thoughts. This is one of the most powerful lessons I've learned working in emerging markets. Turbulence is the official climate of entrepreneurship. Here we're taught to cultivate stability, to avoid uncertainty. But yet uncertainty unleashes creativity. Stability favors the status quo. In 2012, in the midst of the Eurozone crisis, Endeavor launched an office in Greece. And when people were skeptical, I say, when economies turn down, entrepreneurs look up. And there's research to back this up. A study by the Kauffman Foundation said half the Fortune 500 companies today were started in recession or bear market. The list includes FedEx, IBM, Microsoft. Disruption is especially relevant for our last category, our last species, butterflies, the small-scale entrepreneurs. Many of them start in moments of chaos. Many of them become accidental entrepreneurs. Consider the case of a human rights clerical worker named Joanne Rowling. Joanne was, by her own admission, the worst secretary ever. 2 organizations gave her the boot for daydreaming rather than typing. So after one of these sackings, Joanne found herself on a train from Manchester to London, of course, daydreaming. But this time, she allowed this moment of misfortune to unleash the creativity, to think about an imaginary world where a young boy could escape the boring adult world and be transformed when he went on a train to a place where he could find his magical powers. By the time the train pulled into the station, Harry Potter had been born. And that brings me to our last lesson, lesson 6, chaos is your friend. My favorite example of this kind occurred 200 years ago during another period of upheaval. In 1813, during the Napoleonic Wars, Russia invaded France, and the Russian army was looting and pillaging everything, including a vineyard run by Barbe Nicole Ponsardin. Now, Barbe Nicole was a 40-year-old widow. She had married François Clicquot, who died unexpectedly and left her a small family vineyard. The French for widow is veuve, so she became known as Veuve Clicquot. Now, Veuve Clicquot revolutionized the champagne industry. She stored bottles upside down in racks, turned them, and froze off the excess yeast. It resulted in a sharper taste. Her 1811 vintage is said to be the first truly modern champagne. But just as she mastered the process, the Russians came marching in. Most winemakers were shuttering their business, but Veuve Clicquot spotted a marketing opportunity. She resolved to get the Russian army wasted. Today they drink, tomorrow they will pay, she said. She drowned them in free wine. The only vintage she wouldn't share was the 1811. When the French soldiers arrived a few months later to push out the Russians, she did it all over again. She gave Napoleon's army the champagne and the flutes, but they were on horses and couldn't carry the flutes and the champagne bottles at the same time, so they lopped off the necks of the champagne bottles, and that is how Sabrage was born. But her biggest gambit came in the spring of 1814. The war was ending, the soldiers were returning home, so Veuve Clicquot took those bottles of the 1811 vintage and decided to run the blockade. She shipped them to Russia before the peace treaty was officially signed. The plan worked. Her bottles arrived in Moscow and St. Petersburg just as the ceasefire was announced. The Russians were drinking like fish, and even Tsar Alexander declared he would drink nothing but the widow. You know the rest. Veuve Clicquot became an international luxury brand and is credited with being the first woman to lead a multinational business. And there's a kicker to this story, which is that Today, the company Veuve Clicquot gives awards to female business leaders, and I won one of these awards. And the reward was getting a vine named after me in Reims. So the Rottenberg grape may soon be coming to vintage near you. The lesson of the story is this. Entrepreneurs who succeed in times of turmoil don't give in to the agitation around them. They stay calm, they recognize the opportunities the disruption around them creates, and they exploit them. They make chaos their friend. And I want to leave you with one last story. When he was 26, Walt Disney had his life turned upside down. Now, Walt had been a struggling newspaper illustrator. He then launched 2 failed companies with his pal, Ub Iwerks. And then finally, he had a lucky break. He invented a character named Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, which proved to be a hit. So now on top of the world, Walt was in New York for Ozzy to celebrate and to meet the husband of his film distributor. But at the meeting, he got a nasty surprise. The husband had, instead of offering Walt higher profits, informed him that he'd hired away his team of animators and taken over full rights of Oswald. On the train home, Walt was brooding. He was like a raging lion, his wife Lillian said. He had no contract, no employees, and worse yet, he had no cartoon character. Now, everything was taken, the bears, dogs, rabbits, every lovable character was taken, so what did he do? He figured the only thing that hadn't been taken was the mouse. So by the time they got into Kansas City, he'd sketched on train stationery a mouse with red velvet pants and 2 pearly buttons. Now, Walt reportedly wanted to call this creation Mortimer, but his wife Lillian said, no, too sissy. So he said, what do you think about Mickey? It's an Irish name, an outsider's name. She's like, well, it's better than Mortimer. One of the most epic creations in pop culture grew out of a combination of fear and desperation. Mickey Mouse was created in a moment of chaos. As Walt summed up his personality, I function better when things are going badly than when they're smooth as whipped cream. And that's why he's a great entrepreneur. So whenever you hit a wall, whenever you face either a moment of internal self-doubt or external chaos, just remember this. All dreamers face setbacks. The key to acting and thinking like an entrepreneur is to realize that it's not about terrifying leaps of faith and sweeping acts of disruption. It's about building up your emotions to take on the status quo and then tamping down your emotion when the inevitable problems hit. It's about both embracing risk and mitigating risk. It's about achieving daring dreams through prudent steps. And the main piece of advice I want to leave you with is act in the opposite way of everyone around you, and even counter to your own instincts. When your path seems secure and smooth as whipped cream, unsettle it. Push yourself to imagine something fresh, to drum up a dangerous idea, to startle the status quo. When everyone else zags, start zigging. But when your path is unsure and rough, don't cut and run. Stay calm, narrow your options, get the right people on board. Like Wentz's, be a doer, keep going. Like Veuve Clicquot, clink with the enemy. And be sure to stay on that entrepreneurial train. Because if you don't, then while you are somewhere complaining about your misfortune, somewhere someone else will board a train and conceive of Harry Potter or Mickey Mouse or some other crazy invention, and you will be stuck holding Oswald the rabbit. Thank you. Okay, questions? Yeah.
What advice do you have for graduating students who have large debt loads who want to become entrepreneurs?
I think it's a great question. I think that there are programs now in many schools that actually will help if you choose to go either into public service or social entrepreneurship fields. So I don't know if that's true at Stanford. I know that a number of other institutions have that. What I would say is, I mentioned the Endeavor entrepreneurs they're not rich people. It doesn't really take that much to to start something up. I think this is a very real issue. I think that I would look and see. I know there are a number. If you send me your details, I know there are a number of sort of tuition remission sort of funds and scholarships that people are having. Peter Thiel will try to get you just to drop out, I guess. What I would say that, look, even if you need to pay off your loans, you can be disruptive. That's why I talk about skunks. You can be disruptive inside companies and then plan your exit also. I think that what happens is too many people I know are afraid to close doors. I was always told to keep your options open, to keep every door open, and I think you have to close doors. And so even if you do decide to go to a consulting firm for a while or do something on, to make the money, I think if you're keeping those, even on the side, your entrepreneurial energy is going, you won't get golden handcuff. I think it's the people who then start increasing their, it's not just about the loans, they say it's about the loans, but eventually it becomes about the lifestyle that they've created. So I'd say if you're really committed, pay off the loans, but actually just keep your expenses low and keep your entrepreneurial instincts going, and then there's opportunities. But I think this is something that I would think that Stanford, there'd be a number of alumni, if it doesn't already, that would help people who want to do something in the public or social sector. So
there's some options, and probably more people who are looking for that kind of support
yeah.
than money, but there are some options. Yeah, so yeah, you can talk to me too. So.
Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. I wanted to ask you, what's your vision for Endeavor, and what do you see for next 10 years?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. When Edgar Bronfman Jr. became chairman in 2004, we were in 10 countries, Latin America mainly, and we were just starting to launch in Turkey and the Middle East at that point, in South Africa. And he said, okay, Endeavor's charming, and I want it to be important. To which I said, well, can we also be charming when we're important? But he said, I came up with this grand plan for 20 countries by 2020, and he said, I prefer the sound of 25 countries by 2015. So we will be in 25 countries by 2015, and that doesn't include Detroit and Miami. And we started this passive co-investment fund, as I said, so we've raised a little over $25 million so far, where we're co-investing in our companies on the same terms as the lead investors, so we maintain neutrality, and we don't take board seats, so we can still be aligned with the entrepreneurs. There are some exciting developments I'm not really allowed to talk about yet, but hopefully we'll be back next year. But there's really exciting things going on in the impact investing space, and we're actually now playing in that. We may become the first player to go retail in that space, so more on that later. And then we've started a research firm a few years ago, and we were doing some really interesting studies into how ecosystems grow. And we actually are tracing back the role of entrepreneurs in fostering ecosystems and realizing that the entrepreneurs that not only achieve exits but go on to mentor and invest in others are the ones who have outsized influence. So Endeavor is now encouraging all of our entrepreneurs in every industry to become mentors, to become angel investors. So this is something that Fernando Fabre, our president, is now working very hard on. Yep.
Two questions. How does Endeavor source their deals or entrepreneurs? Is it just like friend of a friend, or is there a way for just someone with a good idea to reach out?
Yeah, well, we now operate in 20 countries. The way we go in is, I mentioned my encounter with Eduardo Elstein. That was the first. Now, actually, I no longer stalk. We get phone calls, believe it or not. And we basically build boards of the top business leaders, whether it's in one of the countries or whether it's in a place like Miami. We build teams. We have a team of 350 worldwide. So 40 are based in the U.S. and California and New York, and the rest are in country. So we have teams of people scouring the capital cities and then outside for people that have, we don't take startups, we take scale-ups. So we're looking at people that have some revenue, so anywhere from a couple 100,000 in revenues to about 20 million if they're in an older industry and we really feel like they could get to the next level. And they go through about a year of evaluations by the local business leaders, and 5 or 6 times a year, including one we had in this very room. We have these selection panels, these international selection panels, where VCs and top business leaders from around the world come come and choose the Endeavor entrepreneurs. And I moderate these deliberations. I call it 12 Angry Men. Occasionally there's a woman, but one person can hold out, one person can sway the juror, and it's that by that point, people have gotten such a seal of approval that funders and other people look and see who are the Endeavor entrepreneurs. As I said, we've screened about 40,000 companies and work with just under 1,000 entrepreneurs. So it's a high bar to become an Endeavor entrepreneur.
I also wanted to ask, how do you think about the company that these entrepreneurs are building? Do you screen for like social benefit, or are they just a business that
Yeah, we are agnostic to industry, and I would say that while we want people who have the spirit of doing something positive in their community, and so sometimes many of them that actually at first blush look like they're just tech companies or look like they're just traditional companies, actually are having real meaningful impact in their society. So even something like a company that's the Uber of Mexico, for example, is actually banking the unbanked drivers. So I think you have to look in these markets, and it sounds like you might be from one, you have to look a little more in depth, because even just creating these jobs that are the first to have equity, or the first to actually give benefits that actually can have health care for the children, or in some cases education, is making such a difference in these communities that we didn't want an extra filter of social. But what we find is that, as I said, many of the companies that here would just be kind of more traditional companies, because they're working in these markets, they realize that in the communities, for example, we have a company in Jordan that's a leading chain of pharmacies, and he found that he didn't have enough trained pharmacists, so he started going into schools in Jordan to create mini universities. 70% of the trained pharmacists are women that he hires in the Middle East. We have a tech company in Argentina, Globant, that outsources creativity and engineering. So they did, for example, the magic bands for the Walt Disney. You know, they did those, they did something for Nike, and they didn't have enough talented engineers, so they started running competitions, running hackathons inside universities, and actually creating programs inside universities throughout Latin America to create training programs. So I think that what we're saying is we want these people to have a positive impact on their society, but we think that a lot of times it's the ones that grow that matter. And I think that we did a study, this is really interesting. Some of the times, companies that labeled themselves as social entrepreneurs, that were companies, actually saw a tension between profits and their social impact, and therefore didn't grow. So we said you have to aim for high growth, then you can achieve what your social impact. You can disrupt hospitals, you can fix the education system, but growth is not a bad thing. So I think Endeavor comes in there saying we want the people who are really going to grow and go to scale. Yep.
I think this changes according to the location in the world, obviously, but what are, in your opinion, some promising fields currently or in the future that people should invest in or have, like businesses?
You know, I think that, I mean, if you're looking at emerging markets, I think that one thing we're seeing for sure is that mobile technologies, kids were on mobile much more than they were here. So, I think people have found a way to really make it scale. You look at what's happening in places like India and Africa, and now in Indonesia, we have a couple of companies that are really using mobile technologies to reach the base of the pyramid, but in a very high scale way. That's very exciting. I think that what I've learned, though, and I think that the lesson for people here is, I think we've gotten too caught up in what's the next app, you know, or WhatsApp, rather, here. And I always say, everyone's like, oh, yes, I'm going to be the next Pinterest. I'm like, no, you're going to be the next pets.com. I think that one of the things working in these emerging markets is it's not just the next, technological thing. It's about taking industries that are really ripe for disruption and modernizing them, whether they're family businesses, using technology as an angle, but not as just the only application and luxury. I think back to what I was saying about seeing pain points, and I think that if I had one thing to say here, it's that we have to broaden our view of entrepreneurship. One of my favorite stories is two women who grew up in the favelas in the slums of Rio. And one was a McDonald's cashier and the other was a hairdresser. And Layla, who was the McDonald's cashier, said, poor people deserve to feel beautiful too, and I like this idea of franchising, and why can't we apply it, to people with the Afro-Brazilian hair? We don't have any, hair products. This would help with beauty. She called it lipstick psychology. So she encouraged her sister-in-law Zika to concoct up a new, product, and they tested it out on their husbands. The husband's hair promptly fell out. But they went back to the sink, and we met them, and they had a salon outside of Rio, which had like 6-hour waits. They were going to franchise their products, and they were up against these RFID companies from, all over the world, and tech companies, and people said, I want the hair care ladies. And I always tell this story, and people are like, oh, that's a nice story of women, microfinance. So no. There's nothing micro about Beleza Natural. Last year, it generated over $80 million in revenues. They employ over 2,300 people. The toughest Brazilian private equity firm invested $30 million in them last year. They want to take on L'Oreal. Their next stop is Harlem. And I think that, and she just saw this need. So that's what I've learned about entrepreneurship, is that here we've just reduced it to too narrow a space. My thoughts? Yeah.
So, kind of a related question. Do you think in the United States or other parts of the developed world that in some sense there's a bubble in entrepreneurship, or do you see any, or do you see generally the more the merrier?
Do you use the B word here? Look, I think that, to me, one of the reasons I say crazy is a compliment, I get very nervous when people start thinking that everything's a great idea. So in general, this is why I love that Veuve Clicquot story about chaos. I am much more comfortable when things seem out of the ordinary and everyone thinks it's a bad idea. I get when everything seems like, oh, this is the next Me Too, it just strikes me that there is going to be a problem. I've actually been told that there's a graph done of what industries Harvard Business School students go into. So now it's all hedge funds and these tech companies, so you know that those are the two bubbles waiting to crash. So you follow them and realize they're the latecomers, so do the opposite. I think it's healthy, I think, to have disruption, and I do think that, and I think I love that new study that came out this week, I think it was yesterday, about the top 25 companies where millennials want to work. I mean, how great is it that 7 of them were in healthcare and 7 of them were in the federal government? I mean, beating out Google, beating out Amazon, I mean, that says something. And I think that people here want to marry doing well and doing good, and I think that this is a new opportunity. I think the places that are ripe for disruption are places that really touch people's lives. So I think that you all have an exciting opportunity, not just to create, the next iPhone app, but to really do things that are entrepreneurial, but that touch people's lives. And that's what I've seen working in these markets around the world. Yes, you had a question.
Well, you had talked about surrounding yourself with the right people.
Yes.
You have an idea, and it's critical.
Yes.
You surround yourself with the right people, but how do you go about finding the right people? How do you know when they are the right people?
Yeah, Jen Lim, who runs Delivering Happiness, she co-founded it with Tony Hsieh at Zappos, has a great phrase that she told her entrepreneurs that really resonated with me, which she says, hire slow and fire fast. And I really had to learn this because I was a terrible hirer for a while, so I had to get to be a good firer. And I think that, culture for us, I think that the ability to communicate and telling a story is really important. I actually make everybody who comes to Endeavor read William Zinsser's books on writing well, and I think that is really important today. I also think that culture and ability to expect instability, expect the known, be more agile, I think is something very I think actually it's middle managers that have a problem. I think the millennials are actually doing really well inside companies because by nature you're more collaborative, you don't want to be siloed, and I know this is broad-based, but I just think that, in fact, I think it's people that are used to more traditional leadership styles that are having more problems. But what I would say is I also learned that when you leave a job, or whether you're when you do fire people, I think that what's terrible is that image we have of giving people the box with their droopy plants and their water-stained photos and exiting out in the perp walk. I think that what we've found is just because you make a decision to fire fast, if it's not working out, I mean, Tony Hsieh pays people to leave after 5 days, we give them places to work for several months, we'll give them recommendations. I think that with internet so wide, I mean, people aren't going to leave singing your praise, but you don't want them to be talking about how terrible you were either. And I think that there's this fluidity about how you hire, how you present yourself to employers. If you do leave early, how you change. I think people's trails follow them. And I learned that this was sort of sinking in when my daughters just turned 9 last week, but when they were about 5 or 6, they were home with a friend, and they were singing to the tune of Happy Birthday. My mommy hates work, she fired a jerk, she hired a monkey who ate her homework. And one of my daughters, Tybee, looked at her friend singing this song and says, "Oh, my mommy doesn't fire people. She just tells them they'll be happier elsewhere." Yeah.
So for us who've grown up in Europe or in the US, how do you
Yes.
think about taking a role in these emerging markets, in entrepreneurial emerging markets?
Yeah, I would say that I would say go forth. I really think that this is the best time to be in these markets. I think they still welcome talent. I'm happy. It's linda@endeavor.org. If any of you are interested, and I can put you in touch with people in our offices around the world. I really believe that the world is more global, and if you have an opportunity, whether you're from a certain place or before you go back to wherever you are, to go somewhere else, that it really gives you a sense of what's different and what's similar in each of these contexts. So I really recommend, if you can, spending some time in a different culture. I think it's a great thing, and I think that, as I said, they're craving talent now, so they would welcome you with open arms. Yeah.
Me being from Turkey and knowing a little about emerging markets, I wanted to ask you, what were the biggest challenges you faced working in some emerging markets?
Well, in Turkey, I can't Facebook anymore. No, I'm just kidding. Sorry. We'll cut that from this. I love Turkey. I really do, actually. It's one of my, it's one of my favorite places. It really, really is. I think that, no, I'm so flustered. No, I think that, to me, what's so interesting is that every place we go that's new, every new region, people are like, "Oh, it'll never work here." When we started in Latin America, the idea of entrepreneurship and emerging markets and VC, "Oh, it doesn't work here. It's not Silicon Valley." And then you hear that in Africa, and then you heard that in the Middle East, and now Southeast Asia. And what's so interesting to me is really it's the same everywhere. And I think that people want to take chances. They want to better their lives. They want control over themselves. What's so exciting to me is we get people that are speaking like 10 different languages together, and they're speaking one language, which is entrepreneurship. The hands are flying, the business cards are coming out, they're showing apps, and what's so interesting to me, what I've learned, is just how similar people are across cultures. And that's been the most exciting thing, is the mentoring. We do cross-culturing. And I would say the one thing I've also learned is that I used to think, there's pressure to get the one mentor. Oh my God, I have to find the person and woo them. And now I say, save monogamy for your private life. You want to be poly-mentorish. And I think that getting people who are older than you, younger than you, the same age, in different cultures, I mean, that has been so great. And that this peer-to-peer learning, I think, and then eventually getting people even younger than you, I think is something that we've created this 360 degree of mentoring. It's not just this wizened, gray-haired person who's going to, gently open the doors. But that's what I would say, is just how similar all these people are in all these different contexts. And I'd say the challenge is, I think, just there are, not jokingly, while I don't think governments are the answer, I do think that certain governments just make it it especially difficult for innovation to thrive. I think that some of these markets make it difficult for capital to invest. So I think that that is the only frustration, is that no matter how much you work on the human capital side, I believe in starting with the people and not with the institutions, and yet sometimes the laws and the institutions make it so difficult that it's hard to break through. So that to me is the one thing I wish would change. Yeah?
What do you think about models like Internet in Germany, that they copy successful ideas?
Yeah, look, I think they go to the extreme. I think they're actually copying code, and so I actually have a problem when it gets to that degree. But I'd say that I believe in mini-innovation, and I think some of our entrepreneurs, we have the eBay of Latin America, Mercado Libre. It went public on the NASDAQ. It's now a $6 billion firm. It's the most successful company in endeavor, and people say, oh, they were the copycat of eBay. I was like, no. They minivated. So first of all, in Latin America at the time, internet penetration was 2 or 3%, and no one trusted the internet. No one trusted anybody else in the postal system to deliver things. So they basically they sold only. They didn't have auctions. People were not going to do auctions, so they only sold fixed prices before we did here, and they actually had people meet in cafes to trade the goods. So they minivated, and one of our board members in Mexico created the multi-cinema Cineplex that sold for $300 million. It's called Cinemex. And he said, the only innovation I brought to multi-screen cinemas was that instead of butter, I put chili and lime on the popcorn. So innovation is good. Yeah, did you have a?
Yeah, great. What are some of the main lessons you've learned specifically around job creation, like to really scale up job growth in these emerging markets?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, and that we have. What I would say is that, first of all, it's a small number of entrepreneurs that create most of the jobs. So I think people talk about the startups. This is why we focus on the scale-up phase, that we actually find that starting up, even with all the red tape and bureaucracy, no matter where you are, while that can be challenging, entrepreneurs find a way around it. They get stuck at a certain level, and that's where they flatline, or that's where they can really grow. So number one, we think that focusing on the scale-up is where job creation is. I also think this is why you can't just focus on tech companies when you're doing entrepreneurship, because a lot of times it just makes sense for people to leverage technology and not hire a lot of people, whereas people in the retail, in the food industries, in the healthcare are actually, a lot of times, they may not be the largest revenue creators, but they're the ones that have hundreds, if not thousands, of employees. So having that mixture is where you really get the jobs going. That sounded ominous.